I think there's something quite interesting about the difference between modern and contemporary, where modern artists were often modern women artists were often put into the sort of craft category, and then contemporary women artists are faced with this predicament of engaging with the critical in terms of their bodies, but again having to engage with spaces where those bodies then become the spectacle. So, I mean, again, I'm going to use Pumla's term here, the hyper-visibility, specific type of artists. And I think, often we because they're so hyper-visible, those are the only ones that come to mind. I mean, if you think of the Kenyan artist, Wangechi Mutu's work, you're sort of stuck with the colonial archive. You at once rejecting it, at once critiquing it, but also sort of drawn, and your work is entrenched in it. And I think it's a kind of predicament in terms of what's happened with contemporary women artists that curators often find hard to circumvent, because these have become the canonical artists. I don't know.
I also think, the linearity, as we strive for chronological dating, like to the earliest period, is problematic. Because if we're looking at 1980s, that's very late. So it already means it knocks off people like Gladys Nkadlando and Chika Okeke Ogulu recently wrote, he has that fantastic book out on modernism in Nigeria, right? It's such a wonderful book. But he mentions the fact that even in one of the earliest fine art schools, that there were at least 2 women teachers and are visual artists there. But he literally just mentions their name and doesn't go into dealing with their works. And so we see this long trajectory, but we're actually still writing women out of that history because it's not en masse in the way that it is right now. That we don't have like the huge body that we do right now. But sometimes erasure also becomes a self-perpetuating myth that even we as black feminists or as scholars that are actually should be held accountable for as well. But almost to get back to the point that you're just saying, in the same article, Fall also mentions the prevalent use of bodies, particularly their own bodies, by African women. How do you account for this preoccupation?
Well, I mean, it resurfaces a number of, I think, questions. Artists, what you've written about, that burdened, artists constantly being burdened to speak to the past, to speak to these ills. And so I think, we recall what Okwi reminds us in the 90s, this idea that people were mirroring what is identity. And so where do you start? You start with your own body as a way to reconcile with the way that you are thinking about your practice, and again, I think that responding to a long history of bodies being represented in problematic ways. So how do you regain your own agency, your own voice in speaking about the body and representing it in ways that you want people to engage with it? And so artists, naturally, particularly around the time of the 1990s, there is that turn of people immediately resorting back to speaking from the self and wanting to ask questions about their own identities. The body becomes a starting place. I think obviously over time, artists have complicated what that means and have asked further questions beyond just race, beyond just identity, and asking questions around social justice. So I think I don't want to say it's predictable start, but Ngoni is hinting at a trend that begins to also point at the political moment and asks us to think about, and that's what she tries to do even in that essay. She's also spoken about it in writing about it, right, the kind of questions she had to grapple with being asked as one author from Africa to write about women artists in Africa and what that actually means. What a responsibility to be asked to do such a thing. So she tries to talk about the problematics and the complexities of place and trying to map those kinds of things, but also in getting closer to artists she was interested in writing in and what they were speaking to.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm thinking about my own kind of experiences in art training, and I'm taken back to my choice of choosing to go to Wits Technikon as opposed to Wits University, and that was a very conscious choice at the time. But also then looking at, because I had peers and friends that were at Wits University, and we would conversate around, what are the different ways in which we are being taught this art thing. And for me, it was always, and this was something that I noticed even with, if you look at the artists that have come from this, the Wits Tech school, and those that have come from Wits University, and where we've located ourselves, but what also informs our work. And again, I think with Wits Technikon, for instance, there was a lot of that. This was early 2000s. A lot of that encouragement of like looking at yourself, and it also seemed to be kind of encouraged more so for black students as opposed to white students, which was something that also was quite glaring as well, in the classes, as to why are black students being pushed towards, interrogating themselves and who they are, and white students kind of can free range. You can choose anything you want to, and that was quite a dynamic at the time, yeah.
Yeah, for me, one of the complications when you're working or curating artists' work and they're working with their body in their work, is how do they do this? Because there's sometimes the danger that one might say, I'm intending to be satirical or reverse the image in some sort of way, but in actual fact, without the textual component, what you see is just a reproduced image of this normal or normalized kind of violences that are always perpetuated on those, on black women's bodies. So, while there are possibilities in how the artists work with their bodies, there's also sometimes, for me, a problematic danger when the work is not pushed far enough to take it away from just re-representing in a satirical or metaphorical kind of way the violences or the negative connotations, sort of trying to deal with stereotypes, but in a way reproducing them in the images. And so for me, this is something that comes across quite a lot, and especially in some younger artists, and it takes some time to work through that and arrive at a more resolved way of how do you work with your body. And sometimes that it doesn't happen very well, so yeah, it's problematic.
I'm going to agree with what Usame was saying as well, because also I had the same experiences. I was a PE Technikon, and we were always very few black women students, so we were always the ones that were supposed to present blackness, so you weren't allowed to talk about random things like autism or whatever. Like, you had to speak about how you are rural and have huts in your painting, stuff like that. And so and how you came from this underprivileged background, and so you are grateful to be here amongst the white students. So it always felt like you had to always present your black, especially femaleness, so that, I don't know, you kind of are a witness to whatever black women are supposed to be, and that was a lot of pressure during that time. So I think it stems from that as well during that time.
Another thing that happens, particularly in the 1990s, was this, this moment of autobiographical stances had a lot to do with wanting the immediacy. So performance art, there was a medium shift. So, with other forms of work where, painting become fixed image of the body, but where artists wanted the reaction, they wanted to see the engagement with their audiences, and so there was also that medium shift at that particular moment.